Hi there. I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
I sat frozen, barely breathing, my fingers tight around the stem of a wine glass, heart pounding furiously as my mom raised her glass high and delivered the most cutting toast I'd ever heard. One she packaged neatly as humor, though everyone at the table could feel the sting beneath the laughter. At least Mike didn't drop out of college like some people. The words echoed loudly in my ears, amplified by the laughter erupting around me, a sound that twisted in my gut and burned through layers of my carefully constructed composure, reminding me once again how painfully familiar humiliation felt coming from my own family. Mike's 40th birthday had started exactly as I expected, with me already anxious, already defensive, bracing for the inevitable reminder of how I'd disappointed my mother, how I'd abandoned the golden path she envisioned. A prestigious degree, a stable corporate job, a life easily explained at cocktail parties and family reunions. Instead, I dared to chase something less certain, less conventional, a path she viewed not as brave but reckless, a reflection of my arrogance rather than courage, as if choosing a life I loved was somehow a personal affront against her and the family legacy. My brother Mike sat smugly at the center of attention, laughing a bit louder than everyone else, his perfect posture accentuating every achievement he'd ever attained: the medical degree, the charming spouse, the 3 kids excelling at their elite private school. And despite myself, I envied him for a brief moment, for the ease with which our family celebrated him, for the uncomplicated approval he'd always enjoyed, something I had never known and had long since stopped hoping for. But tonight was different. Tonight I had something in my pocket more powerful than my mother's casual cruelty, something that would finally change the narrative she had crafted around me, and I could hardly wait to deliver the blow I'd rehearsed in my mind countless times, carefully timed for maximum impact. As the laughter faded into polite chuckles and awkward coughs, eyes around the table glanced my way, sensing the awkwardness my mother's comment had created, a silent apology in some faces. But no one spoke up. No one ever spoke up. And so, smiling quietly, I picked up my glass, raised it gently in the direction of my brother, and offered a toast of my own, brief and measured, filled with the sincerity I genuinely felt despite the tension thrumming through my veins. To Mike, I began, allowing a meaningful pause. May you always feel as accomplished and fulfilled as our family believes you to be. The words landed softly, subtly ambiguous, and Mike's eyes narrowed slightly, unsure if he'd just been complimented or insulted. But before he could question it further, I placed my glass down and resumed the role of passive observer. The dinner continued, with small talk drifting through courses. Each plate brought to the table a temporary distraction from the underlying current of tension between my mother and me, a dynamic I felt increasingly sure was about to shift dramatically. Dessert finally arrived: chocolate mousse cake garnished with overly elaborate swirls of whipped cream, and just as Mike dipped his fork eagerly into his slice, savoring his birthday indulgence, I casually reached into my bag and drew out the slim envelope I'd been gripping all night. Calmly, deliberately, I slid the envelope across the polished wood of the table, watching with satisfaction as it stopped neatly in front of Mike, who glanced at me confusedly before opening it with exaggerated curiosity. I leaned back, savoring each second of his expression, transforming from amusement to astonishment, disbelief clouding his previously smug demeanor, his fork falling loudly onto his dessert plate, the sharp clatter silencing the remaining murmurs of conversation around us. My mother's attention shifted sharply, her eyes widening as she registered Mike's stunned face, the rest of the table slowly becoming aware of the significance of the moment, as Mike finally looked up at me, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Is this real, Jess?" I simply nodded, my voice steady and measured, carrying the quiet confidence I'd worked years to cultivate. "Yes, Mike. My company just got acquired, officially, as of yesterday," I stated, savoring the stunned silence that followed. It was the satisfaction I'd always imagined, but had feared I might never experience. watching as realization rippled outward, overtaking the table until all eyes turned toward my mother, whose lips parted slightly, clearly struggling to find words that would soften the blow of this unexpected reversal of her favored narrative. Yet, beneath the rush of victory and vindication, something else stirred uneasily inside me, an unsettling awareness that this was merely the beginning, that this carefully orchestrated revenge, satisfying as it was, might also expose deeper cracks and hidden truths within our family, truths that once unveiled might prove impossible to contain or forgive. But as I watched my mother's face flush with discomfort, her usual poise fractured by uncertainty, I knew there was no turning back. Whatever storm I had unleashed tonight was now entirely beyond my control, and I had no choice but to face it head-on, armed only with the unsettling knowledge that my mother's secrets might soon become my own. The silence hung thickly in the air, stretched tight with tension, and as my brother Mike's stunned expression slowly shifted from disbelief to something resembling wounded pride, I felt an unexpected pang of guilt mixed oddly with my triumph, though my gaze never wavered from his as I watched the wheels of realization spinning behind his eyes. My heart beat steadily now, emboldened by the validation I'd long craved, yet even in this moment of vindication, my mother's expression, the subtle tightening of her jaw, the faint twitch of her eyelid, signaled to me that victory was never straightforward in a family like ours, where every success came shadowed with invisible conditions and expectations. Mike's voice broke the strained quiet first, coming out slightly strained yet forcibly casual, as if he hoped by dismissing my news, he could somehow reclaim the evening spotlight that I'd unexpectedly stolen. And he remarked with forced levity, "Wow, Jess, who knew your hobby would actually pay off? Literally." Laughter trickled nervously from a few family members, though it was clear his attempt at humor had failed to restore his diminished confidence, and he glanced at our mother as if seeking reassurance that his status as golden child had not been permanently tarnished by my unexpected rise. But my mother remained silent, her eyes still fixed on the contract spread open in front of Mike, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing, and in that silence, I felt both triumph and bitterness intertwined, knowing that her inability to respond positively or even acknowledge my achievement confirmed my worst suspicion. She would rather cling stubbornly to old resentments than celebrate a victory she had never believed I could achieve. Still, something inside me stirred, a defiance born of years of quietly endured dismissals and disappointments, compelling me to push just a little further, perhaps even dangerously close to cruelty, driven by a desire to finally shatter the false narrative of inadequacy she had constructed around me for decades. Leaning forward deliberately, careful to maintain the composed expression I'd spent years perfecting, I addressed Mike directly, my tone gentle, but pointed enough that everyone at the table heard clearly. "Funny how you always joke that I'd end up in your basement, right, Mike? Turns out it might be the other way around now." The table erupted briefly with surprised laughter, a nervous energy that quickly fizzled into tense silence as my mother sharply inhaled, visibly uncomfortable, her eyes flicking toward me in warning, a silent command to rein myself in, as though my mere success threatened her carefully maintained balance of family power dynamics. Mike reddened visibly, struggling to formulate a witty retort, but before he could respond, my mother finally broke her silence, her voice deceptively calm, yet laced with an edge that only I, after years of practice, could fully discern. "Well, Jess, it's certainly impressive, though I imagine something like that requires more luck than anything else. And luck has a funny way of running out." Her words landed softly yet venomously, designed to undermine rather than congratulate, diminishing my success by framing it as fleeting, accidental, something undeserved rather than earned through grit and sacrifice. At that moment, a deep sadness mixed with anger surged inside me. Emotions I thought I'd long buried, triggered by her instinctual need to undercut rather than acknowledge my accomplishment. And it was then that I decided impulsively to reveal my second bombshell, a fact I had planned to save for a quieter moment, but now felt compelled to announce publicly, driven by a desire to puncture her dismissive words once and for all. With deliberate calmness, I cleared my throat, drawing everyone's attention back to me before speaking clearly and slowly, relishing every syllable, knowing the impact would resonate deeply. Oh, by the way, Mom, Harvard Business School invited me to give a keynote next month to discuss what it really takes to succeed as an entrepreneur. Apparently, they think I have some valuable insights, even without a college degree. Mike's eyes widened again, his mouth falling open slightly, unable to mask the renewed shock this additional revelation sparked, while my mother visibly paled, her facade finally cracking enough for everyone to see the depth of her astonishment and frustration. Unable to deny or diminish such explicit validation from an institution she revered more than almost anything else. Yet instead of offering me even grudging acknowledgement, she unexpectedly leaned forward, eyes narrowing into an expression I'd rarely seen but instinctively feared, her voice lowering ominously as she warned cryptically, "Be careful, Jessica. Success built on a shaky foundation tends to expose things people would rather keep hidden." A chill ran through me at her cryptic threat, instantly aware that her words carried deeper meaning, hinting at secrets buried beneath our family's polished surface, things I was suddenly terrified and yet oddly desperate to uncover. As the table erupted into whispers, speculations running rampant around us, I felt a deepening sense of uncertainty, a realization that my carefully crafted revenge had set into motion something darker and more complicated than I'd ever anticipated. And now, standing at the edge of the unknown, I understood that true victory might come at a cost higher than I ever imagined possible. The aftermath of my revelation lingered uncomfortably in the air, reverberating through every corner of the house, each whispered conversation laced with suspicion, curiosity, and thinly disguised envy. As our relatives quietly speculated behind half-closed doors about what I'd uncovered, while I wrestled with a growing unease that my carefully executed revenge had not only struck deeper than intended, but had also exposed vulnerabilities within our family I had never anticipated, shaking loose long-hidden truths that might never again remain neatly buried. My triumph, once sharp and satisfying, had begun to dull with the realization that success, no matter how sweet, carried a cost, and that cost was becoming clearer by the hour. As Mike avoided my gaze, my mother retreated into brittle silence, and even my father, usually detached and easygoing, found himself awkwardly attempting to mediate the tension that now permeated every family interaction, as if I had unintentionally shattered something fundamental to our delicate peace. The morning after Mike's disastrous birthday dinner, the atmosphere at the breakfast table was thick with unresolved emotions, punctuated only by the comfortable clinking of forks and subdued conversation as everyone carefully avoided any topic remotely connected to my announcement, though the tension remained palpable, hovering just beneath the surface like an unspoken threat. My mother, ever the master of passive aggression, busied herself excessively with trivial household tasks, intentionally creating noise and distraction. Her refusal to meet my eyes speaking volumes more than any direct confrontation could, while Mike sullenly poured himself coffee, his usual charm replaced by a visible bitterness I had rarely witnessed. A bitterness that only grew more evident as he finally glanced up and caught me watching him, forcing us both into a strained silence that stretched out painfully, neither of us willing to break the fragile truce by addressing the obvious. Yet as awkward as Mike's visible resentment felt, it was nothing compared to the icy discomfort radiating from my mother, whose refusal to acknowledge my accomplishments directly revealed more clearly than ever her inability to reconcile the daughter she had imagined with the woman I had become, her silence a statement far louder than any word she could have spoken. Still, beneath my frustration and hurt lay a lingering curiosity sparked by her cryptic comment the night before, and the sense that she was hiding something significant, a secret powerful enough to overshadow even my recent successes. continued to gnaw at the edge of my consciousness, fueling an obsession that grew more irresistible with each passing moment, pushing me to pry into places perhaps better left undisturbed. Later that afternoon, driven by a restless anxiety that refused to fade, I found myself alone in my childhood room, searching through old boxes of memories and half-forgotten letters, desperately hoping for clues that might explain my mother's cryptic threats. A quest that felt increasingly irrational, yet impossible to abandon. It was there, buried beneath dusty yearbooks and faded photographs, that I discovered an unopened letter, its edges worn and brittle, marked simply with my mother's handwriting and a date from more than 30 years earlier. A letter clearly meant for someone else but never sent, hidden here as if she had hoped to erase its existence entirely. My pulse quickened painfully as I stared at the envelope, instinctively aware that this single piece of forgotten paper might finally reveal the truth she was so determined to conceal, yet terrified by the weight of what I might discover, as if holding it brought me one step closer to irreversibly altering the fragile balance of our lives. With trembling fingers, I carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the pages slowly, my heart hammering in my chest as I began to read words written long before I was born. Words that revealed a painful truth about my mother's past. The existence of a child, a daughter, born years before she met my father. A child she had willingly abandoned. A choice she clearly regretted yet fiercely protected from discovery, explaining in part her obsessive focus on reputation and success, and her intense resistance to anyone, especially me, who threatened the carefully crafted image of perfection she'd spent decades constructing. The shock of the revelation stole my breath, leaving me reeling with questions and emotions too complex to immediately untangle, as I grappled not only with my mother's hidden past, but also with the painful realization that her harshness toward me might stem less from disapproval than from fear, a fear that her own shameful choices might be repeated, a fear that had distorted her love into constant, punishing scrutiny. In that moment, overwhelmed and profoundly conflicted, I understood that revenge, once so satisfyingly simple, was no longer possible, replaced instead by a complicated mixture of empathy, anger, and deep sadness, a realization that I could no longer view my mother simply as an antagonist, but as a deeply flawed woman haunted by her past mistakes, desperately clinging to control in the only ways she knew how. Yet even as empathy began to soften my anger, I realized this newfound knowledge could never remain private, that confronting my mother and potentially meeting the half-sister she'd abandoned was inevitable, a confrontation certain to force truths to the surface, truths that might offer healing, but might just as easily shatter everything we'd ever believed about ourselves and each other, leaving me trapped in an unbearable uncertainty about what might follow. The realization of my mother's carefully concealed secret had transformed the quiet discomfort I once felt toward her into a complicated web of confusion, empathy, and simmering resentment, emotions that now twisted painfully within me as I sat silently in my car, parked just outside my parents' home, wrestling with how best to confront her about the child she had abandoned, a sister I never knew existed, whose existence shifted everything I believed about my family, fracturing the carefully constructed narrative I had been told since childhood, and shaking my sense of identity so thoroughly that even the recent victory of my business success paled beside this revelation. With every passing minute, my indecision grew heavier, a restless anxiety coursing through me, urging me forward, yet pulling me back, caught between a desire to finally uncover the whole truth and a deeper fear of what confronting my mother might mean. Not just for me, but for all of us, because I knew instinctively this wasn't something that could remain quietly hidden, not anymore. Eventually, driven by an impulse stronger than caution, I stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the front door, each step feeling heavier than the last, the letter clutched tightly in my hand like a lifeline, or perhaps a weapon, knowing it held the power to unearth decades of pain. My mother had desperately attempted to forget, and wondering if exposing it now, so many years later, was selfish cruelty, or a necessary step toward finally breaking the cycle of secrecy that had warped our relationships for far too long. The moment my mother opened the door, I could see from the nervous flicker in her eyes that she sensed immediately something had shifted, the tension between us crackling like electricity. Yet still she attempted to maintain her facade, greeting me with forced cheerfulness that faltered the moment she glanced down at the envelope trembling slightly in my hand, a recognition that drained the color from her face, her carefully maintained composure crumbling visibly under the weight of what she now understood I knew. As I stepped inside, the silence between us thickened unbearably, a tension neither of us dared immediately break, both aware of the irreversible consequences that would follow our first words, until finally I gathered the courage to speak, my voice shaking slightly despite my efforts to sound steady and strong. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" The question hung heavily in the air, filled with accusations and hurt. Yet beneath the anger lay a plea for honesty, an attempt to understand the choice she had made, a choice that had shaped every aspect of our lives in ways we'd never fully realized. My mother's reaction surprised me deeply. Instead of the defensive hostility I expected, she sank onto the couch, her shoulders collapsing under the invisible weight of years spent carrying this burden alone, and her voice broke slightly as she began to speak, confessing quietly, almost desperately, how she had been young and terrified, pressured by her family into believing that giving up her firstborn daughter was the only way to preserve her future, a future she later built upon the fragile illusion of perfection that was now unraveling completely. Listening to her, my anger softened into sorrowful understanding, my heart aching not just for the sister I'd never known, but also for the woman sitting before me, who had sacrificed so much, too much, to uphold appearances, forced into silence by shame that should never have been hers to bear alone. Yet even as compassion grew within me, the bitterness of years spent under her harsh scrutiny remained raw and unresolved. I found myself torn painfully between forgiveness and lingering resentment, recognizing that her controlling judgment of my life and choices had stemmed from the deep-seated fear that I might somehow repeat her past mistakes, projecting her own unhealed wounds onto me, a realization both enlightening and devastating, illuminating clearly for the first time the roots of our lifelong conflict yet, leaving me uncertain how to proceed, caught between my own need for reconciliation and the weight of grievances too deeply embedded to easily forgive. Finally, compelled by an inner need for resolution, I took a deep breath and revealed what had become my next difficult decision, that I had already reached out online to the half-sister she had hidden away, discovering in the process that she lived a life strangely parallel to my own, successful but fiercely independent, clearly carrying her own scars, yet seemingly open to connection despite the painful past we shared. My mother's reaction was immediate and visceral, her eyes widening in shock, filled briefly with panic, before shifting slowly toward a resigned sadness as she accepted this moment was now beyond her control, the truth she had suppressed finally emerging into the harsh light, no longer hers to hide or protect, forcing her to confront openly what she'd spent decades avoiding. As the conversation ended, heavy and unresolved, I realized our relationship would never return to the fragile normalcy we once pretended was enough, forever changed by truths now laid bare, truths that could either destroy the tenuous bonds we had, or perhaps offer an opportunity for genuine healing. Though at this moment, I remained profoundly uncertain which outcome felt more likely. Walking away from my childhood home, the letter still clutched tightly in my hand, I understood for the first time that the revenge I'd initially sought had taken me to places far more complicated than I ever imagined, leaving me standing at the precipice of reconciliation or ruin, unsure if revealing the truth had set us free or merely plunged us deeper into pain we might never fully escape. In the days following the confrontation with my mother, a conversation that had felt more like surgery without anesthesia than any cathartic resolution, I found myself floating between emotional exhaustion and sharp surges of clarity, as if every thought I'd ever buried about my family had suddenly surfaced at once, demanding my full attention, no longer willing to remain confined to the quiet corners of my subconscious. I couldn't stop thinking about the sister I'd never known, the woman who had existed like a ghost in the background of our family story, erased intentionally, yet whose absence had left an unmistakable void, one I hadn't understood until now. Reaching out to her had felt like tossing a stone into dark water, not knowing what, if anything, might emerge from the ripples. And when she finally responded, just a simple, cautiously worded message acknowledging that yes, she knew about my mother, and yes, she had questions of her own. It felt like stepping through a doorway I couldn't and wouldn't close again. Her name was Kate, and in the strange way life sometimes plays tricks on us, she had walked a path startlingly similar to mine, building a career from scratch without the cushion of family support, forging her own identity through sheer determination and grit. And while our upbringings were radically different, there was a resonance between us that I couldn't ignore, a shared strength shaped not by who raised us, but by who didn't. We spoke over video first, both of us cautious, yet curious, circling around the subject of our mother like survivors of the same shipwreck examining the pieces they'd each managed to hold on to. And as we traded stories, some painful, some absurdly familiar, I felt something crack open inside me, a strange, unexpected relief at finally knowing that someone else understood, someone who hadn't been brainwashed by the polished facade our mother had spent decades crafting. As we got to know each other, I couldn't help but feel the temptation of justice, that part of me still hungry for reckoning, still wanting to turn the tables completely and force my mother to confront not just her shame, but the consequences of bearing it, to make her sit at a table with both of her daughters and explain herself with no lies left to hide behind. The idea brewed quietly in the back of my mind until it became something I could no longer ignore. Not just a fantasy, but a plan. Something deliberate and, in my mind, necessary. A final chapter that wouldn't just expose the truth, but redefine the power dynamic that had defined our family for far too long. So I invited Kate to a family dinner, the kind of casual Sunday gathering my mother still insisted on hosting, where Mike would be present with his picture-perfect family, where no one would suspect anything until it was far too late for my mother to retreat. When the day arrived, the air around the house was thick with anticipation only I could feel, and as Kate walked through the front door with the confident, slightly guarded demeanor of someone who had learned long ago not to expect kindness where it wasn't offered, I saw my mother's face drain of color in real time, her eyes locking on Kate's with a mix of disbelief, fear, and recognition, so intense that for a full minute no one spoke, the silence louder than any scream. My father looked confused, Mike irritated, and the rest of the table shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something monumental had just happened, though they couldn't quite understand what. I watched my mother try to collect herself, saw her open her mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came out, as if the sheer force of the truth had paralyzed her ability to spin it into something safe. Kate, ever more composed than I could have managed, broke the silence first, her voice calm but firm as she introduced herself simply. "I'm Kate, Laura's oldest daughter." The room went completely still, and I could hear the sound of a glass setting too hard against the table, followed by the collective intake of breath as understanding finally dawned on everyone present. What followed was not a scream, not a fight, but a long, uncomfortable unraveling, as if every carefully placed piece of my mother's story began to slide out of place under the weight of its own dishonesty. No one moved for what felt like hours, and when my mother finally spoke, her voice was small, almost childlike, asking softly if we could speak privately. But Kate refused, and so did I, because what needed to be said wasn't just between the three of us anymore. It had infected our entire family, and everyone deserved to see it laid bare. My mother apologized, haltingly, awkwardly, without the polish she usually reserved for public moments, her words shaped more by guilt than accountability, but for the first time, I saw in her something real, something stripped of vanity and control, a woman truly broken by the weight of her own decisions. Whether it was enough remained unclear. Mike, for his part, stayed silent through most of it, perhaps unwilling to confront what this meant for his own place in the family, or maybe simply stunned into humility. And though I saw no malice in his eyes, I saw no warmth either, just a kind of quiet reckoning that mirrored my own years ago, when I realized being the favorite didn't mean being loved for who you are. As the evening wound down, people left without the usual hugs or promises to catch up soon, the house quieter than I'd ever heard it, not just in volume but in tone, as if every voice had been dulled by the weight of what had transpired. My mother stood alone in the dining room, clutching a crumpled napkin like a lifeline, eyes distant, as if trying to remember the version of her life that had just unraveled beyond repair, while Kate and I stepped out into the cool night air, both of us unsure of what came next, but equally certain that the past would no longer define us in silence. Whether this confrontation could ever truly be called revenge, I wasn't sure anymore, because in exposing the truth, I had unearthed something deeper than satisfaction. I had found a strange kind of freedom, one that didn't erase the pain, but allowed space for something new, something honest, something earned. And as I looked over at Kate, walking beside me with the quiet strength of someone who had faced her share of storms and survived, I realized that maybe this story didn't need a clean ending, because the truth, once released, writes its own chapters, and some of them are best left unwritten, at least for now.